It's easy to get pessimistic about politics. From the climate crisis to inequality and a heap of stuff in between, it's certainly the case that things aren't looking too great right now. Worse still, efforts to push political leaders to deal with some of these issues have tended to be, at best, ignored, if not outright suppressed. Over the past few years, the term Doomerism has emerged as a way to describe a tendency among mostly younger people to simply step back and accept that things are just going to get worse forever. But what if that's bad, actually? What if, even among all the gloominess, there is a place and a need for positive thinking? Maybe even utopian thinking? In order to explore this need for utopias a little further, I rang up someone whose videos always leave me feeling a little bit more positive about the future of the world around us, Andrewism. Andrewism, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for setting aside some time to chat with me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom. I'm glad to be here.
How are you? You having a good day so far? I know it's much earlier where you are than it is for me.
Not too much earlier, but the weather is really nice. You know, the sun is right there in the sky, unencumbered by the clouds, and just finished watering my plants, so I'm having a good day.
I'm very jealous. We have a very kind of British grey day today, which is
Right.
a bit after a nice weekend. So it's been nice, and now it's awful. but but well, which I suppose maybe sort of leads us on very well to the topic that we're going to talk about today, which is kind of Doomerism and utopianism in contemporary politics, and I suppose specifically in online politics, because that's maybe the spaces that a lot of people that engage with both of our videos possibly spend a lot of their time. And I suppose the reason I was really keen to ask you if you'd be willing to come on and chat to me was that your videos tend to deviate from that sense of cynicism, which I often see as a bit of a norm, and maybe I'm wrong in that. But I've watched your videos for quite some time now. Maybe I don't know how long have you been making videos?
I began in 2020, or mid 2020.
So a good few years. I feel like I've maybe been watching them for 1-2 years, maybe. But I always feel like I come away from your videos with a little bit of hope about the world around me.
I'm glad to hear that. That is the intention.
I was going to say, is that something that you really sit down and think about when you're dreaming up what you're going to make videos about and what you when you're writing them?
Yeah, I think for me, so I began in 2020, and the sort of video essay wave, and the sort of counter offensive to a lot of the right wing stuff that was dominating the media in like 2015, 2016. I had consumed a lot of that, and I was very much that all that content stuff helped me to move from well, at one point I was, I had grown up in a sort of a religious environment and a conservative environment, and so I kind of moved out of that, in addition to other sources and stuff, and media and stuff that I'd consumed, and just general personal life stuff, work experience, that kind of thing. And so the content that I was consuming, the video essays and stuff, it was really helping me to expand my understanding and my worldview, and to shift my perspective further and further leftward, towards ideas and perspectives that were more cosmopolitan and more in line with, I think, some of my internal values deep down were. And so that content and stuff was really helping me. But one thing I noticed about that content was that a lot of it was very much focused on the issues and what the issues are, and describing and explaining the issues. And that absolutely has its place, because I wouldn't be where I am today without those sorts of discussions and videos and topics. But I felt like there was a missing piece in those discussions. I didn't actually set out originally to become a YouTuber. What happened was that I was writing for a personal blog, and I decided that one of my blog posts would be better formatted as a video, and that's kind of how the whole thing started. I didn't set out to like
Oh, that's interesting.
change the game in that sense. I just realized blogging's kind of like a dying medium, and I wanted to try something different.
Yeah.
And so I realized like I kind of wanted to fill that gap, um, and sort of be that sort of person that I feel like I needed when I was early on in my journey. Someone who wasn't just like explaining the issues, but also talking about how we can make an impact as individuals, as collectives, and beyond.
Yeah, I've been thinking as I've been doing a bit of prep for our chat, been thinking about like that's very much my tendency is to uh, try and explain the world as it exists at the moment, I guess, whether that's that I want to explain a particular institution that exists or explain a trend within contemporary politics or or explain a series of historical events that have somehow led us up to today. My tendency is always to try and explain things as they are. And then I always find conclusion sections for videos really hard to write because I suddenly feel like, oh, do I have to say something about how the world could be different? And that suddenly brings you to a slightly more vulnerable place, I think. In fact, I was thinking back. I know you're a really big fan of David Graeber, aren't you?
Yeah, for sure.
I know he pops up in a bunch of your videos in different contexts. And I was thinking back to there's a passage in Bullshit Jobs, probably towards the end, I would imagine, in which he talks about uh, the ways in which he tends to avoid putting sort of policy proposals and stuff in his books. Because if you say, I think in Bullshit Jobs, he's specifically talking about UBI, I think, Universal Basic Income, where he sort of suggests, well, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this because then if someone says, well, I don't agree with UBI, then potentially they throw away the rest of his analysis as well. And so
Right.
therefore he maybe avoids trying to go do too much beyond going, this is a thing that has happened or a thing that exists, because then you do end up in that slightly more uh, vulnerable place, I guess. Which yeah, I definitely feel a lot in. It's much easier to say this thing exists and is flawed or is bad or is complicated because it's often easy for lots of people to agree with you to say one thing is bad. Whereas as soon as you go, oh, but this is the specific thing we should do to fix it, suddenly that opens you up to a slightly different kind of criticism, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that I've had to face, right? Well, I say face. I'll get into that another time. In venturing into not just what is, but also what if, I've
Mm.
definitely had to encounter instances of people who just, I mean, there are lots of different reactions, but one of the many reactions is just flat out rejecting it. Like, no, because human nature, or no, because we're doomed, or no, because no, you know? And so I think in coming up with those solutions, not just like describing the problem, there's definitely there's definitely that sort of thing that you were describing where you have to deal with people's rebuttals, and in those rebuttals you have to wonder if they've just completely not absorbed everything else, just completely rejected everything else.
Yeah. So as I was sitting down and doing a little bit of reading a few bits and watching a few bits in prep for this, I was trying to kind of map out sort of various different types or different aspects of our culture that I do think push us towards making a kind of doomerism a more palatable option, I guess, or at least an easier option. Because I don't know, Do you agree with me that that is a thing that you see a lot? I definitely find on Twitter, at least, there is a lot of it's easier to sort of throw sticks at things than it is to propose
Oh
a.
yeah, definitely. And it, it it is actually one of the primary reasons that I've disengaged from Twitter entirely.
Mm,
You actually reached out to me on Twitter, and the only reason I saw it was because I had logged into, I think, um, like repost a video or something like that.
mm,
And that's how we ended up having this conversation. But I've really made the conscious decision to, I think, since March, to just literally log off.
mm,
Because I tried other things before, Twitter could be kind of addictive. I tried getting one of those like website blockers. I deleted the app, but I would always find ways to get around those things. And it's only when I made that conscious decision to literally log off, I was able to move past it. And in logging off and having that distance, I realized the sort of cycles it's easy to fall into when in that space.
mm.
The sort of all or nothing mentalities, the lack of nuance, the lack of, uh, to borrow the phrase, remembering the human
Mm.
um, behind the screen.
There's something
And
about the
so,
form of it, I think, of just if you've only got 140 characters or 280, whatever it is these days, you it's much easier to write this thing is bad than it is to write your 12 theses on a better tomorrow because
yeah,
you literally don't have the space to offer that kind of nuance before you've written an incredibly long thread. But also then I think that's become baked into the culture of the site
exactly.
as well.
And I think another detrimental aspect of it is the way that, as you said, the culture is sort of shaped, and then it shapes your engagement with it. And so um, you find yourself thinking in ways that you might not have otherwise, if not
Mm,
for being on that site. And then also, there's the whole component is sort of the dark side of the internet. The good side of the internet and the dark side of the internet are kind of the same thing, right? The good side is we can talk to anybody in the world. The bad side is anybody in the world could talk to us. Um, and so that sort of leads to a situation where you're being exposed accidentally, algorithmically, to a lot of really harmful content. You're seeing constant conflict, you're seeing constant disagreement, you're seeing constant polarization.
mm,
Um, and it really makes it difficult for you to then go and interact with people, particularly for those who spend a lot of time on that site, to actually interact with people in reality and to deal with the good, bad, and ugly of real life. A lot of it is just the bad and the ugly that you see on Twitter, but there's also good there out in the world. And I know it's actually a conversation I was having the other day. Um, and this is going to sound out of character for people who have seen my stuff, because I know I very intentionally put out a very particular impression, right?
mm,
Um, but I was having a conversation the other day, and I was talking about how there are so many things to mourn about the state of the world right now, and it's very easy to potentially fall into that sort of perpetual mourning. Um, I think it's something that we are all potentially vulnerable to succumbing to. When you think about all the different things that are happening, all the things that are unaddressed, all the things that you're aware of. Um, but I think that emboldens me to focus on, to pursue, to try to contribute to the efforts to make things better, to the good that is taking place in the world, to the
mm.
transformations and changes that are happening in different pockets everywhere, that I would like to see, to explore, and to highlight.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you bring up there about actually the state of the world, it makes sense to be pessimistic in some regards, right? Without me suggesting that that is the thing to do. Yeah, we face kind of ecological collapse, and inequality is growing wider and wider. Sort of in many ways, of course, it's easier to fall into that trap. I was also doing some thinking about the ways in which mainstream politics, and I don't know to what extent this might also be mirrored in Trinidad, but definitely in the UK, is that mainstream politics is sort of inherently pessimistic in terms of it's always we
Oh
can't
yeah,
afford to do
definitely.
the thing. The national the national debt is too high, and therefore we can't do X, we can't do Y. We know
Or
we
you
should. Oh yeah,
you'll
sorry.
actually have conversations about doing things. That's so interesting. Nah, but I think there is that sort of built-in component in mainstream politics here and abroad. This sort of sense of like pre-engineered apathy,
Mm,
like the way that it's structured, the way that it's set up. It's like the only way to stay like mentally stable is to like sort of check out.
mm,
Because when you hear, oh, this drama and this party said this about this, the opposition party, and the opposition party says this about the ruling party, and this drama and this corruption scandal and this, that, and the other, um, it's just exhausting. I think for
mm.
everyday people who are like, wow, how am I going to feed my children today? It's, like, what does this have to do with me? You know?
Yeah, yeah. When inflation's at 11%, or as it's been in the UK recently, but the main news story is that yeah, someone lied about having a party at the wrong time, and it just sort of feels so minor in comparison to the actual uh, issue, or there's a coronation going on, so everything's
Exactly.
about people
Exactly.
going
There's
wild.
actually it was like a blip in the news, but it was a very major discussion online,
Mm,
where it's kind of exposed exactly how much government ministers were making.
mm,
So they were getting like, in addition to a salary, they were getting a housing allowance, they were getting a food allowance, they were getting a transportation allowance, they were getting I think a healthcare allowance, they getting a whole bunch of different allowances. And on top of that, they also get like, they're exempt from paying certain taxes and tariffs and imports and stuff. They're exempt from certain like things when you're trying to get like bring in a vehicle, or so on top of their existing exorbitant salaries, they also have all these additional expenses covered by these individual allowances. Um, and then they have the audacity to turn around and tell people, oh, well, tighten your belts, we're in a
mm.
recession, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, which itself can then, I often think when there's something, when the kind of anger at the kind of political class can often, if it shuts people off from, in shutting people off from that particular kind of representative democracy in terms of going out and voting, can also shut people off from broader ways of thinking about how the world can be
Oh,
different as
definitely.
well.
Because I think part of the way that these sort of representative and parliamentary democracies are developed, you end up in a situation where people view any sort of political engagement through that narrow lens.
Mm,
So any solution, any sort of doing politics, any and everything has to go through that channel. You want to talk about, for example, establishing a community garden. You talk about that with people, and they'll be like, "Oh, okay, so um, who do we need to?" And this is a sort of exaggerated example. Who do you need to vote for to make this happen, right? Um, or they might say in a discussion about housing or about education, there's like, okay, what petition do we need to sign to get this policy into place? It's not a matter of sort of recognizing their power.
mm, what can
It's
I do?
it's sort
Yeah.
of like, we don't have any power, so let the people who rule over us make these decisions. When I think half the battle is getting people to recognize our own power to implement these changes and transformations for ourselves without waiting for these authority figures to make those moves for us.
Yeah, and I want to talk shortly a little bit about some of the sort of, I guess, optimistic trends that have begun to emerge, particularly around. I know you recently made a video about solar punk and urban planning, um, and that's made so much sense to me in terms of some of the more optimistic stuff that you talk about in terms of your discussions of solar punk and how that fits in with a movement that I think is inherently, although often I'm not sure everyone that is watching lots of not just bikes or City Beautiful or Anna Fisher video. Like, not everyone is necessarily watching those videos and thinking, I am doing politics, but it definitely is in a really big way. But maybe we'll come on to that shortly, because I guess first we need to jump the gap between I think we've acknowledged that this aspect of I think Doomerism is the word that I've heard thrown around quite a lot, as a way of capturing this sometimes dominant, at least, sense of pessimism and cynicism that can exist around politics. And I think in the UK and possibly in America a little bit as well, some of that has also been a consequence of the end of the sort of Jeremy Corbyn Labour movement and the Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns, in terms of there was for a brief time something for people that were on the left and looking for something really positive to work with, to jump on board with, I guess. And then those movements have come to an end, and now people that were maybe being drawn to those are now without something positive to contribute to. And almost there's a phrase in the UK that it's the hope that kills you. I don't know if that translates over internationally, particularly something that I think football fans say a lot. If you ever watch your football team come close to winning something.
Side note, who do you back, by the way?
So I live in Plymouth, so generally Plymouth Argyle, who have just been promoted from League One to the Championship, which is below the Premiership.
Right. Well, congrats to your team. I'm Manchester United all the way, but anyway, proceed.
I've only actually been to Home Park with Torch game once this year, because as soon as they were doing well, suddenly it was sold out every week, and I watched them lose 5-0, I think. So in a season when they've done incredibly well, I was there to watch them lose 5-0. But anyway,
incredible.
But I think there's almost that similar thing of for a lot of, I say young people, but I think that's overplayed sometimes. I don't think that those kind of millennial socialist movements, I don't think, were all young people. I think that they were actually fairly intergenerational, but almost having a bit of hope and then seeing that sort of crushed almost makes it worse in some way. But utopias are important, right? I mean, the go-to quote is the Gramsci quote about being an optimist. What is the quote? I'm a pessimist because of intellect, but an optimist because of will. Is the quote. That things might be we might look logically at the world around us and decide that the most logical option is to fall into a sense of pessimism and cynicism and doomerism. However, something has to push us towards. I mean, this is a quote heavy episode because I just happened to stumble across a lot of sort of pithy things, but I was also coming across I came across Le Guin's quote about Le Guin quote about living in capitalism and its power seeming inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings, and that kind of sense of maybe it does seem all consuming, but if you lived in France in 1788, oh my god, my dates have gone, then so did the divine right of kings then, and then a sort of bad winter happened and it all crumbled. Um, what is it that the thing we talked earlier about
Right.
the ways in which your videos sort of avoid some of that cynicism and do have a real hopeful tinge to them. I think in both form and content, I think your way of delivering them is also I think it's so easy on when you're making videos online to sort of be a kind of shock jock almost, and to be behind the
Right.
microphone. And I fall into it all the time. I'm not suggesting this is something other people do that I don't, but
Hmm.
it's really easy to sort of just throw barbs out at everyone, and um, it's often easy to sort of be quite cruel in some ways towards people that you disagree with, and to always be sort of getting attention, and everything's a silly joke. And but I always feel like yours, both in form and content, have a sense of uh, optimism and finding where the hope lies, even in things that are um, horrific, I guess. Uh, how do you do that? Where does that where do you think that comes from in your drive to make those videos slightly different?
Hmm. Hmm. Um.
Is this one of those things that it's easier for someone external to notice maybe than it is for you on the inside making them?
Yes, I believe so. I mean, I know in terms of content that I make like a concerted effort to. Um. Well, I'm a bit. I wouldn't use that term. Um. I wouldn't say conflict averse, but I'm not. I avoid I avoid antagonizing.
Hmm.
Um. And I adopt a sort of a conversational approach because um, I think I'm trying to connect with people as if I was having a conversation with them,
Yeah. Yeah.
as if I was just sort of talking to somebody I'd just met about an idea or about something I'd learned about. I mean, my tagline from the beginning of the creation of my channel was I'm trying to learn and explore as much as possible, and I think that sort of mindset has informed my approach and the way that I deliver what I'm learning, because I'm still learning and I'm still exploring and I'm still trying to figure things out. But in that, I kind of want to bring people along for that.
Hmm.
And I want people to recognize, just as I recognized in this learning and exploring, that there are more possibilities outside of what dominates these mainstream narratives. One of the early videos I had done that I think also sort of helped to frame the context of my channel was a video on the psychology of collapse. Um, and it addressed the sort of dominant, sort of doomerist strand or reaction, but it also delved into other responses that people have had to collapse. The sort of embrace of blissful ignorance, denialism, you have apathy, and you have people who sort of preoccupy themselves with busy work and distract themselves. You have people who delve into the sort of hedonistic take on, let Rome burn while I dance kind of thing. Um,
Hmm.
you have people who are just overwhelmed. Um, you have people who fall into this sort of trap of blind hope, because I think we are somewhat biologically predisposed towards optimism. Um, but in the video, as I conclude, there's sort of two paths that one can adopt. The inner path of self healing, of looking within oneself and developing yourself self awareness, and um, sort of taking this grand scale issue and putting it into a personal context. And then there's the outer path of what I dubbed balanced realism, um, where you sort of reject both pessimism and optimism in a sense. Um,
Mm.
You acknowledge that there are many ways that this thing could turn out, but you choose, and so you remain balanced in that respect, but you choose to focus on how you can influence that outcome. You basically, you agitate for the best, as I said in the video, but you prepare for the worst.
Mm. I often
And I think, I'll go ahead.
Oh no, your comment about busy work there. I sometimes think, to what extent are the videos that when I'm making videos, to what extent is it actually having a useful impact in the world in any way, shape, or form, or to what extent is it just me sort of busying myself with something that feels vaguely adjacent to uh, some of the problems at hand, and therefore can take up all my time without necessarily actually contributing to. I mean, that's a whole different conversation about
Yeah, no, but
about
I,
to what impact does creating videos, or I mean, even writing books, I
yeah, and
guess,
that's
have.
something that I grapple with as well. Um,
Mm,
I mean, I'm using the talents that I do have, my ability to write, my ability to speak, um, and I'm using that to sort of to attempt to help people
mm,
via the internet. Um, all of my life experiences, education, etc., would have led to me eventually being the person I am today that is able to do this. Um, but I do grapple with, um, is this the sort of the best use of
yeah.
that? Is this, should I deviate from, you know, my skills and talents to do something that is more externally validated as useful, right? I think there's a sort of stereotype of what the a good activist looks like. Um,
Mm,
it's like, oh, if you're not at soup kitchens and if you're not out there planting trees and tying yourself to trees and bombing pipelines and all these different things, are you really doing anything to actually change the circumstances? And I do think there is an element where you have to say, um, my role in this movement for change or whatever is, um, it is not as risky as the people who
mm,
are, you know, putting their lives in line in that way.
yeah.
Um, and it may not be as impressive or as, you know, headline making, but does that mean it doesn't still have value?
Hey, I hope you're enjoying my chat with Andrewism. If you are, and you'd like to check out further episodes of the show, then you might like to know that every single episode of Induction is released a full 2 weeks earlier on my streaming service, Nebula. That essentially means that there's always one more episode available to watch or listen to over on Nebula than there is anywhere else. Right now, that episode is a chat that I had with Lena Norms about how to survive your 20s in a world that is just a little bit on fire. Nebula is packed with all kinds of early access and exclusive content from all your favourite creators. Philosophy Tube, Lindsay Ellis, Foreign Man in a Foreign Land, and many, many more. In fact, I just released a whole class exclusively over on Nebula, in which I take you through the process that I use to research my videos. From finding good sources, to reading books and articles, to taking really good, useful notes, it's not only a little bit of a behind the scenes peek at how I work, it also will leave you with tons of pointers for your own research projects too. If you'd like to check out Nebula, then I would be particularly grateful if you do so using my special personalised link go.nebula.tv/induction. This will bag you a full 40% off an annual plan, bringing the cost down to just $2.50 a month. Which, for all the brilliant exclusive content on there, is frankly a steal. That link again is go.nebula.tv/induction. But with that out of the way, back to my chat with Andrewism. I mean, I think it does take all sorts of people with all sorts of different skills and interests and um, ways of doing things to kind of push the world to a better place. I know I went to a political meeting not too long ago where the person who was sort of leading the session, I mean, it was one of those where officially the session is led by everyone, but there's a facilitator, and and someone clearly has more of an idea of what the norms of how this works is, and sort of held the space. And I was definitely thinking, oh, okay, this person is really good. This person is an organizer, right? In a way that I would not be very good at doing that. Like this person stood up and is engaging like in just enough of a way that everyone gets a bit excited to be there and thinks, oh, this was a good use of my time, and breaks the ice really well. Because that, I think that is a real, it's always one thing to say, start a local chapter of your union, or start an org, or whatever it is. But actually that is kind of a set of skills, right, that not everyone has. And it was really interesting. I was like, oh, I'm glad that there is people out there doing this, and I'm and I was recognizing that I'm someone who will turn up to stuff, and I will make my skills useful in whatever way I can. But but I couldn't facilitate the room, maybe, or at least there's better at doing it than me.
You're trying to create this new society, but then in an effort to do so, because certain abilities were not distributed, certain privileges were not deconstructed, you have situations where you have like this new overclass of people who began as the facilitators, and then did not distribute that ability to facilitate and distribute that ability to engage in politics and decision making evenly. And
Because they just happen to be the most charismatic
exactly,
person, and
exactly.
therefore, because I guess our sense of who counts as being charismatic is also
Yeah,
very much
even
socially
something as
constructed, right?
shallow as how a person looks will definitely determine that. You know,
Mm.
in terms of
Yeah, I mean,
attractiveness, in terms of race, in terms of ability, all those different things would inform that.
yeah, definitely. I know that despite saying that I'm not a particularly great facilitator and enthuser of people in a sort of circle in a room, I do know that if I get up as a white able-bodied guy and say, oh, I think we should do like, but there is a sort of socially constructed vision of who can legitimately be heard, that will mean that I will that my taking of space and power in that room will be seen as a more natural thing. And no, and I think uh, that is absolutely right. That we have to not always lean to who is seen to be more skilled at certain
Yeah, I
things,
would
because
also
then we
add,
we do.
um, on a sort of a lighter note, I think your British accent might also inform how people.
Absolutely. And in fact, yeah,
Accents are
when I
really
make
impactful. Yeah,
like when I often in my day-to-day life, I will have a bit more of a West Country twang when I talk than when I make videos on the internet, because I know that talking in a certain way does sound more authoritative. And I don't think I necessarily think that process through in my head
yeah.
of going, oh, I shouldn't be like, all right, guys, let's crack on. But I, but I, but there's a subconscious process through which I go, oh, I need to be presentable, and I need to be professional. And because those things overlap with ideas, I mean, I could talk for a very long time about the politics of accent in the UK,
Mm,
but because those things overlap in my head, I uh, do that and accidentally walk into putting on my best BBC received pronunciation to talk, right?
Yeah, yeah, and I think as somebody in my context in Trinidad, um, with my background and everything, the way that I speak is definitely informed by my background, my education, and everything. Um, there are a variety of accents informed by a person's ethnic background, informed by a person's location. Like a rural East Indian living in the South is going to sound different from an urban uh, capital, someone living in the urban capital. And then there are differences between the people living in the urban capital depending on, what school they went to. There are certain schools that have a very specific accent. Um, and all those things inform how people are received. Um, the sort of continuum between the so-called acrolect, which is the sort of closest form of the dialect to standard English, compared to the
Mm.
basilect, which would be the what people would call broken English in some circles, the sort of Creole language. Honestly, it's in a language of its own,
Mm.
um, and so having grown up in that environment, I find myself shifting across that continuum. So like sometimes I would, um, like if I'm going to a bank or something, I would speak in a particular way. Um, and then when talking with friends, I'll speak a different way. Speaking at home, and I would
Yeah.
speak a different way. And it's just that sort of accent politics is just interesting to me that it occurs all over the place.
Mm. Yeah, because in other spaces, if you speak with, I definitely know that if in other spaces, if I go in, I'm like, hello, thank you, I would like a drink, like then that suddenly is marks you out in a different way, I guess, because suddenly you are other to the sort of accent community, I guess, for want of a better word, of a slightly different space.
Yeah, I mean,
It
even
is
even as I'm
interesting how.
speaking right now, I mean, I'm noticing the way that I enunciate certain things that I wouldn't enunciate in casual conversation, because when you're speaking for an international audience, you want to be legible, right? You want to be understood. And I know that some aspects of the Trini accent are not as easy to understand. So even how I speak on YouTube and how I speak on podcasts and stuff will be shaped by that.
Mm. It's interesting that uh, as soon as we start, and I think that the conversation we've been having has been um completely right and useful, but it is really interesting the ways in which as soon as we start to try and talk about visions of the future, we instantly then go back and unpick all uh, the ways in which different hierarchies might jump out.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real distinction between, I guess, the kind of conversation that we're talking, where we're having, where we go, oh, okay, so these are some other things we want to take into account in our vision of the future that we're painting, and another tendency where often, because someone sets out a potential vision for what the world could look like in the future, and then someone points out a flaw in it, there's often a tendency to then completely shut down the idea that a better world at all is possible ever.
Oh yeah, that's
Um,
like it's kind of like it's something you see a lot in YouTube comments, and it's also
mm.
it's like that meme, um, typo detected, opinion discarded. It's like, oh,
for
I just
me,
pointed out a mistake, therefore I don't have to listen to anything you have to say.
I mean, for me, the kind of cultural encapsulation of it, I think, is Black Mirror,
Hmm.
is the which I really enjoyed when it first came out, and I think is one of those shows that has had a. Have you watched Black Mirror?
Yes, yes, not all the
You're
episodes,
aware
but
of
yeah,
sort of aware of the basic concept, because I think early on, I think it's also one of those shows that just almost made itself a pastiche of itself just by existing for just by being really popular,
right.
and therefore it becomes cliche because it sort of made itself cliche. But as it went on, it became, I think I think it was in Vice maybe that someone described it as being what if phones but too much, because every episode
I've heard
is,
that tagline.
imagine if we had this. Yeah, every episode has this thing of going, oh, imagine if you had this new app on your phone, and then it's good for 20 minutes and then it's bad for 40 minutes. And but then generally it widened out, because I think the show tries to not just be about technology, it tries to be about the ways in which people engage with technology. But all the episodes, or at least the default episode, feels like it's, what if the world could be better? Oh no, of course it can't. Haha, everything is bad forever. And that sort of feels like that is the opposite
It's something
way
I've
of,
noticed in
you know,
media. There's been a sort of a shift, in a sense, and I don't know if Black Mirror has had a part to play in it. I'd have to see some media analysis on that, but this sort of shift from happy endings and good endings, and that's sort of, and now we're seeing a lot of neutral endings, questionable endings, bad endings. Bad endings and stuff used to be a rarity, I think, in some horrors. Whereas now I think more and more horrors, and I've only recently gotten into the genre, so I could be wrong, but I feel like I've seen a sort of a shift from, oh, and our protagonist make it out in the end, to, oh well, that's it. I don't want to spoil any particular properties I've seen recently, but I don't know. Is that something that you've noticed as well? The sort of shift in.
There's a rewarding of cynicism at the end, that actually we were right to think that we were right to be pessimistic, because the good guys won, but it turned out the good guys were actually the bad guys. I think, like,
I think if
I don't know why the Hunger Games.
I was
jumping
literally
out at
just
me.
gonna, I was just gonna call out Hunger Games, even though in the end, there's a sort of happy ending. Katniss has to make a decision for that happy ending to take place, because just as you think, oh, there's been a victory for the oppressed classes, it's like, wait, no, new challenger approaches.
I don't know why that. I guess because the whole because I guess it is so. The storyline has kind of a revolutionary element to it. I guess.
I mean, for me, it jumped out
overthrowing
immediately because I rewatched all the movies recently. So,
and I mean, it's also something that always comes up. I feel like the French Revolution comes up a lot in my videos for whatever reason. It's always either I bring up a current thing, and to understand it, it's either we need to understand neoliberalism in the kind of neoliberal revolution in the late 70s, or we need to understand the French Revolution.
I just had a flashback to like 5 of your videos.
Like it's my current thing of like, I'm gonna have to talk about this thing again. Although in some regards, I then go, maybe it's okay, because it means that I end up learning more about those.
Yeah, and then you
so
also reinforce in people's understanding. The more they watch, the better they understand.
So, but it is a thing that I notice in my when I'm like, oh no, I've done it again. but there's a comment that quite often happens where I'll talk about the French Revolution as a sort of major sort of world historical event that was important in solidifying the shift towards the world we have today. And someone will comment and say, oh, it seems like you think the French Revolution's good. Well, actually, very quickly, it was bad. And there's obviously a really complex history there. But I'm sort of
I
left
see you've
thinking,
met anonymous commenter number 763.
Who obviously watches both our work. But there's this really interesting thing where it's like, well, there's so many other aspects of contemporary life that I don't know, maybe is that too sort of big event history to suggest that the French Revolution is so foundational to so many different aspects of our contemporary life that I feel like, well, if you want to throw that out, you're sort of throwing out quite a lot of the way in which the world has shifted away from feudalism, and therefore it sort of becomes you're throwing out of it entirely becomes itself a slightly interesting proposition.
Yeah, I think a lot of my recent exploration of the French Revolution specifically has been through the lens of the subsequent Haitian Revolution, because I'm actually reading Black Jacobins right now, so by C.L.R. James,
Oh,
and
cool.
yeah, it's just these historical moments, um, and the many, many, many ways that they shape the way that we understand the world today. Um,
Mm.
it's just fascinating. But that's like a brief aside.
I mean, I guess uh, to to get onto, I suppose, which I think you've touched upon loads of times already in the video, but your particular vision of a potential future is the idea that I think you frequently come back to recently on your channel is this idea of solar punk. And I was wondering if for anyone that's listening that hasn't watched those videos or is maybe as I wasn't before I watched your videos about it, isn't as familiar with this idea as a potential positive way of looking at the future whilst taking into account inequality and climate change. Could you explain a little bit about what solar punk is and what the appeal that you see in it is?
Yeah, so Soulpunk is a sort of an online movement that is sort of shifting offline. Um, and it's everything from a sort of imagining of our collective futures to actually creating it. It started as a sort of parody or deviation from the cyberpunk genre. It was like cyberpunk, but what if hopeful and green, um, and trees on buildings, and that's what it was for a while. But there's been, I think, a considered shift in the past few years. I would say thanks in part to the explosion of my video on the topic on my channel, in addition to just general change in the zeitgeist post pandemic. Um, well, quote unquote post pandemic.
Mm,
Uh, but there's been a shift from that sort of aesthetic to an actual engagement with, okay, so how do we make this a real thing? Um, it's not just about what we hope for, um, although it is about what we should hope for rather than just what we should avoid. But it's beyond what we should just hope for, but also about how we do that, how we make that happen, how we build beyond the limitations of capitalism, how we go beyond what is to what if, beyond the current rift between humanity and nature. Um, kind of began and sort of took off in like the early 2000s, late 2000s, early 2010s. Um, and since the publication of since its inception, really, there've been sort of hints of that, of people wanting to push it beyond. I think that's starting to pick up more and more as climate change continues to descend upon us, and as people are just looking for ways to not fall into that sort of doom and apathy. Um,
mm. My understanding is it's a kind of uh, localist in the sense of looking locally, not localist in the sense of uh, feeling detached from the rest of the world, I guess.
yeah,
Kind of ecological anarchist kind of crossover.
yes. The emphasis on localism in solarpunk is not to sort of dismiss the need for like globe spanning changes, but it's to recognize that uh, for those changes to take place, it is not something that will. I mean, they've had plenty of time, and we've seen in action. Um, those changes that we need on a global stage are going to begin on that grassroots local stage. Um,
Mm.
because they've had plenty of time, or rulers and politicians have had plenty of time to make changes. They've had plenty of opportunities to do so, um, and they have not. And so,
And I think I have noticed a bit of a uh, broader thing in which I've noticed a lot of people starting to take a lot more of that view of what can I do in my immediate proximity uh, that is political in the sense of that it is engaging with uh, community and it is engaging with but engaging with community in a sense of how do we fit into the wider community of the whole world? How do we live together and organize our society, but in ways that start really locally? I think as I was saying much earlier in the episode, I was talking about when I saw your video about solar punk and urban planning. It sort of popped up on my feed somewhere, and it really made sense. As if I was like, oh yes, of course, this is a really, having heard you speak about um, solar punk in other videos, and having seen the rise of all of this interest in, and we've done an episode with Jason from Not Just Bikes. We talk a little bit about urban planning and the rise of interest in that, which I think not everyone who engages with that content would necessarily immediately think of it as political or doing politics. However, I don't know. I look at it and go, of course it is. It's about how does your, and maybe more people do than I'm not sort of suggesting that no one does, but that it's about how, what is prioritized in my local community. Is it people that are driving through in cars, or is it people who are, wanting to have a block or a neighborhood that feels like a place rather than just a space that we go through? It's about what we're prioritizing in terms of, is it cars which are inherently kind of individualist in some way and polluting, or uh, is it more, or is it public transport, right? Which very often serves people who have lower incomes and are unable to afford to maintain a car, which can be quite expensive. And yeah, when I saw that video, I don't know, it just really made sense as a crossing over of things and as
Yeah.
a slightly more explicit politicization of it. And I
I
know
think
there
to be
are
more,
creators. Sorry.
yeah, no, go ahead. I think in effort to be more descriptive for those who haven't seen the video,
Yeah, sorry.
solar punk, the sort of intersection of solar punk and city planning that I attempted to address, is really one that attempts to see how we, well, for one, it's to help us understand um, that sort of disparity between what social ecologist Murray Bookchin calls first nature, which is the evolved natural, what we call natural world, and second nature, which is the society that humans have created, um, and how we can bring those two natures back into alignment to create a sort of a third nature. Um, and then go on to talk about the way that city planning has been shaped by corporate concerns and the desire to uh, control workers and control space, and shifting that into us recognizing our right to the city as a right based in full and extent and entire use of the places that surround us. This idea that we have no say in our immediate environment is, well, I wouldn't say unheard of historically. It is definitely not the norm in the vastness of, human history. The idea that you cannot shape your immediate neighborhood to suit your needs, um, is patently absurd. I think
Mm.
a solar punk approach to city planning would be a bottom up approach that emphasizes ecological integration, uh, that would take on a decolonial approach, um, that would bend to the organic needs of the people themselves, and that would be participatory in its planning. I think one particular example that I wanted to bring up in this episode um, was the idea of guerrilla bottom up placemaking, right? As seen in examples like the Better Block movement, uh, which basically began as a group of people were having a discussion about cities around the world and the things that they liked and visiting those places, and why couldn't their street look like that? And they stopped and they decided, wait, we can make our cities look like that. And over the course of a weekend, they transformed their street. They painted the street. They put out benches. They put out chairs. They put out tables. They blocked off car traffic and um, basically broke the rules and the city ordinances that had been in place. Um, but they had a more vibrant, a more live street. They had bike lanes. They had food markets. They had a beer garden. And they created that together as a community. Um, and so,
Which is really interesting because I'm not sure exactly when this episode will go out,
right.
but the weekend that we are recording it, or the weekend coming that we're recording it, is the coronation in the UK of the new king. I'm obviously deeply excited about, and there is, and actually, excitement for it generally, I don't think is that high. Like most people don't seem to be that interested. However, I talked to a few people who are going to events. So there's a kind of tradition in the UK of street parties at royal events where you do block off a little bit of a certain street and you bring out tables and everyone makes food and brings that out to share, and or maybe you all eat together. And I think I've spoken to a couple of people that have either went to ones as part of the Queen's Jubilee last year, or were planning to go to ones as part of the coronation this year, and have said that actually the coronation bit is sort of by the by.
Mm-hmm.
That actually the reason they're going is because there's this fantastic opportunity to be in the street, and suddenly a space that you know really well is different, and that's kind of exciting because A, you're stood in the road or sat in the road. B, it's decorated differently. C, everyone is there.
Yeah.
And it's also this fantastic opportunity to talk to your neighbors in a slightly different way than you might normally, right?
Right.
You're not just talking about when do the bins go out. You do suddenly have that opportunity to go,
To socialize,
oh, I
to
see you
actually
around.
have a neighborly
Yeah.
interaction with your neighbors. Yeah. I think it's also
Which
similar what you're describing to how Trinidad, sort of, at least the capital and certain towns and stuff, transforms over the course of Carnival, right? On Carnival Monday and Tuesday. Carnival being local celebration, best show on earth, etc., etc. Excuse my patriotism. um, but there's a transformation of the streets. The streets are overrun by colorful masquerades. It's overrun by on Carnival Monday with the Juve celebration with paint and with mud. It's like one big street parade / party, and um, it is such a necessary break from the norm when, for a lot of people's lives, it's this constant feeling of atomization, is this sort of separation. And I mean, the things I would critique about it, because I feel like it's a sort of like release valve for the stresses of capitalism. And I feel as though
kind of carnival-esque.
and I feel as though the companies that profit, there are certain companies that would profit from, for example, the heavy use of alcohol and the way that alcoholism shapes our society and da 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 da. But let's stick to the positives for now. I think the idea of that sort of street celebration, of people being able to come together and in good spirits and in comradeship, camaraderie and stuff, it's beautiful to see.
Even within something that in reality, like you say, is maybe organized by and held by the same companies that are making the city a bit of a misery to live in the rest of the time, you still find that sense of,
well,
like,
not organized by, but partially sponsored by, but
yeah. I mean, and kind of allowed by, I guess they sort of probably give it some boundaries in terms of what can and can't happen.
Yeah.
But like a risk of giving a third example and making it a bit laborious. I often think the same about protest, where often the reason that people are at a protest or a march,
it's not necessarily to see change. It's more so to connect with people who see the same as you.
Well, I think that the reason you often go is often for a negative reason, right? It's often because something is bad. But actually, what happens when people get together isn't just that everyone gets together and commiserates. actually something exciting
Yeah.
happens because you are taking up a space in a slightly different way, and you are with people that you probably agree on some stuff with, and therefore have a sense of at least a broadly similar direction you'd like the world to go in, and you've probably done something creative by making a placard and or dressing up, and actually, although you are potentially there to protest something, potentially horrific, depending on what it is, like maybe it's the maybe it's the fact that the world is burning, right? You're potentially there for a quite horrific, terrifying reason, and yet within that, the fact that there is other people there and you can connect with other people who also think that it is bad that the world is ending, means
It's
that a
cathartic.
sense of catharsis and kind of optimism, I guess, can come from that. Which, I mean, to bring it back around to where we started, where we were talking a little bit about Twitter, being in the same space as people, I think, can be energizing in that way, because I don't know, you do get those human connections in a way that sometimes online interaction can't facilitate in quite the same way.
Yeah.
Which maybe is a nice place to round this off. I feel like I did very well there to brilliantly bring it round.
Yeah,
Well,
fantastic.
sort of pat myself
Round of
without
applause.
like pat myself on the back. Well done me. I think I've undermined it now by pointing it out. But, but thank you. But yeah, no. But thank you so much for setting aside some time to chat with me today. If people haven't seen your fantastic videos and would like to go away and find them, how would they go about doing so?
Sure. So you could check out my channel, youtube.com/Andrewism, or you could just search in the YouTube search bar for Andrewism. And I'm not really on Twitter anymore, so I would usually tell people, "Oh, go follow me on Twitter."
You've managed to kick.
I managed to kick the habit, and I'm trying to keep it that way. But if you like what I do, you could also check out my Patreon, patreon.com/Saint Drew, and that's about it.
Cool. Well, yeah, thank you so much again for chatting to me. And yeah, thank you everyone who is listening and watching for doing that. Thank you so much for listening to my chat with Andrewism and for making it all the way to the end. I hope you've got something interesting out of it to go away and think about along the way. As I said during the show, if you'd like to check out the very, very latest episode of Induction right now, then you can do so by heading over to my premium streaming service, Nebula. You can grab 40% off an annual plan whilst helping to support us to make more episodes of the show by heading over to go.nebula.tv/induction. Thanks again for watching, and see you in the next episode.